Before 1941, the German military operated on a simple doctrine: speed. Through Poland and France, their panzer divisions pushed forward relentlessly, bypassing strong points and collapsing defenses before they could even form. That momentum carried over into Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million German soldiers flooded into the Soviet Union, along a front stretching nearly 2,000 miles. But this sprawling machine was not built for a standstill, and it was certainly not built for the Russian winter. By the time they reached the gates of Moscow, temperatures had dropped low enough to freeze engine oil solid, bringing the advance to a halt. The failure at Moscow forced the German high command into a realization: a quick knockout blow was no longer possible, and to fight a prolonged war, they urgently needed raw resources. To keep the war machine running, Hitler ordered a strategic pivot in the summer of 1942. This map of the Eastern Front illustrates that shift, tracing the primary German advance away from Moscow and driving deep into the south to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus. But standing right on the flank of that advance was a major industrial transit hub anchored to the banks of the Volga River, the city of Stalingrad. The German assault followed a familiar pattern. Before sending a single ground unit into the streets, the Luftwaffe dropped thousands of tons of explosives to flatten the resistance. Instead of clearing a path, the massive explosions reduced functional city blocks to an impenetrable, jagged maze of shattered concrete and twisted steel. For an army built to outflank and outmaneuver the enemy in open terrain, the German doctrine of maneuver crumbled the moment they entered this self-made wasteland. The Soviet defenders were under strict directives. Joseph Stalin had issued Order 227, not one step back. The Red Army had to hold the rubble at all costs, facing execution if they retreated across the Volga. To survive the relentless German firepower, the Soviets developed an ingenious tactic. Looking at this schematic of the street-level fighting, you can see the Soviet forces intentionally pressing their front lines to within 50 yards of the German positions. By hugging the enemy, the Soviets neutralized Germany's air superiority. Any bomb dropped by the Luftwaffe would now instantly vaporize their own men alongside the defenders. Combat devolved into a grueling building-to-building nightmare the Germans called the Rottenkrieg, or Rat War. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand for individual rooms, stairwells, and sewer pipes. Inside a single fortified apartment building known as Pavlov's house, a solitary Soviet platoon held out for 2 months. In that time, they killed or wounded more attacking soldiers than the entire invasion of France. Yet, by November 1942, the German command believed they were winning. They had bled for months to secure 90% of the city, pinning the exhausted Soviet defenders right against the freezing banks of the river. They were so fixated on claiming those final few yards of rubble that they entirely missed a strategic vulnerability expanding right behind their own lines. Zooming out to the macro-strategic level, the real shape of the battlefield becomes visible. The urban meat grinder had slowly pulled the vast majority of the elite, heavily armed German units directly into the center of Stalingrad. To keep those core units supplied and protected, the German flanks, stretching hundreds of miles to the north and south, were handed over to Allied Romanian and Italian armies, which lacked heavy anti-tank weapons and cold-weather gear. The Soviets saw the overextension. They launched Operation Uranus, unleashing a massive, synchronized counteroffensive that smashed directly through those poorly defended flanks. In just 4 days, the 2 Soviet spearheads carved through the snow and linked up perfectly behind the city, instantly severing every single supply line and communication wire. The heavy engagement in the ruins effectively anchored the elite German units in a static position. This prolonged fighting kept the 6th Army in the city's center long enough for the outer pincers to close the pocket around them. General Paulus radioed Berlin, begging for permission to attempt a breakout before Soviet lines solidified. Hitler categorically refused, ordering the 6th Army to hold their ground to the last man. The trapped army required hundreds of tons of food, fuel, and ammunition every single day. The Luftwaffe promised to deliver it from the air, but the reality of Soviet anti-aircraft fire and brutal weather meant only a fraction of those supplies ever hit the drop zones. Inside the pocket, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Cut off from the world, tens of thousands of soldiers succumbed to mass starvation and extreme frostbite, while enduring a constant, unyielding barrage of Soviet artillery. By refusing to yield a single inch of ground, Hitler's strategic arrogance turned a brilliant Soviet tactical maneuver into a guaranteed death sentence for his greatest army. On January 31, 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army finally surrendered. Of the roughly 300,000 men originally caught in the encirclement, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. Across the entire campaign, the casualties on both sides reached a staggering 2 million, cementing Stalingrad as the deadliest single battle in human history. The military fallout was total. The Wehrmacht lost its offensive capability on the Eastern Front, reversing the momentum of the war. The rubble of Stalingrad became the psychological graveyard of the Third Reich. By bleeding their enemy dry on the banks of the Volga, the Soviet Union paved a bloody, irreversible road directly to Berlin.